I am the scientific coordinator of the African Climate Project. We are going to start now our webinar where we have our expert guest from Lisbon, Sérgio Teixeira, and he's going to talk today about how to finance climate change adaptation projects in Africa. But before we start, I would like to mention that several of our colleagues are also present and that we have several participants already online. Also, we would like to mention to you that the webinar of today is going to be recorded, and you will be able to find it next week on YouTube, maybe between Monday and Tuesday. And also, if you are interested, you are going to be able to find the PowerPoint presentations on the African website also later this week, or maybe early next week. We are going to have two presentations today. So one just to introduce our project, the African Climate Project, and the second one that is the technical presentation. And as you can see, you have a chat. So we would like to ask you to maybe keep your questions for the end of the presentations, because we need to maximize the screen so that you can have a better view of the slides. And that means that you will not be able to see the chat. But please keep your questions, and after the second presentation, you will be able to put them on chat, and we will try to answer all of them, and also with a discussion. We are looking forward for this webinar for about 1 hour, 10 minutes, depending on how many questions we have at the end. To start with, I would like to explain you a little bit, to introduce you to the African Climate Project, and as our second presentation I mentioned, the Access to Finance for Climate Change Adaptation Projects. So, as I mentioned before, my name is Rocio Díaz-Chavez, and I'm a research fellow at Imperial College London in the Center for Environmental Policy. And I have been working with different projects related to renewable energy with a focus on bioenergy and climate change in different regions, including also Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And I have been the scientific coordinator of this project that I'm going to introduce to you. After mentioning just very general notes on climate change that you already know, probably on the book that climate change has been considered one of the defining and more critical issues on the last decades. It is one of the issues that have been affecting severely Africa, and it's considered that it's the most vulnerable continent, especially for these impacts. And many of the issues that we're really concerned about the future are related to adaptation strategies. And for this, it is something that we have considered that it is knowledge intensive. And for that reason, we consider that there have to be better ways to transfer this knowledge, or to disseminate this knowledge, to share it. We recognize also that mitigation has a big role also with the climate change in Africa. And investment regarding climate change in Africa has also been quite large. The African Development Banks have been investing, or had a plan on investing around $10 billion since 2011 and until 2015. Until the last couple of years, it was around $4 billion American dollars. And it is considered that also until the year 2030, it will be necessary to invest other $675 billion to low carbon development in Africa. And most of these investments have been done on adaptation. Under this kind of scenario, we have this project called African Climate that is an EU-funded project. It has a duration of 3 years. We started in October in 2011, and we are going to finish around September in this year. We are a team of 5 African countries and 5 African organizations and 5 European organizations. You can see them on the slide. So we have DTU, Practical Action, Imperial College, PAU, and BID, who is the coordinator of the project. And in Africa, we have ENDA, we have ICPAC, we had ICRAF, FARMPAN, and WITS University in South Africa. The main objective of our project is to develop a web-based knowledge platform, which makes it more dynamic and interactive for the users, and it is mainly to share all this knowledge on climate change, on research, and also on good practices. We have different types of innovative and creative web tools, and we have also different languages using this web portal. You can find the link to it, and I'm pretty sure that you found probably also through our website the communication for the webinar today. Our climate portal has different areas. Some of them are related to research, to policy, financing, good practices, and also detailed information about countries. And we have different topics as well. So we have, for example, climate change adaptation mitigation, different sectors, and all countries in Africa. You can see our portal also contains different type of information related also to financing and to policy. We have different topics also included in the knowledge database, from agriculture to water use to indigenous knowledge, and also other types of publications, links, and tools. We have also several joint initiatives and supporters that have been included in our web portal, and you can see here some of them, like the BBC from the UK, Africa Adapt, also a multi-partner initiative, Africa Talks Climate, Africa Adaptation Knowledge Network, Farm 98 FM, that's a radio, and Green Africa Directory. And I would like to then introduce you to our presenter today, Mr. Sérgio Santos. He is an expert on financial aspects. His background is on environmental engineering and environmental science and management. And his expertise is in the promotion of energy efficiency, carbon management, markets, and mitigation projects. He also is an expert on climate change and development, particularly with adaptation strategies. And he has also created several companies consultancy companies in Lisbon. He has worked actively with the African Development Bank and the UNDP, among different types of organizations. So I would like to ask Sergio to at least say hello. Sergio, can you put your camera on, please?
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon to all the participants, and thank you, Rocio, for that introduction.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Well, thank you very much, Sergio, for accepting to be with us today. We know that you are a very busy person, but we really appreciate your expertise for today.
Thank you very much, Rocio. I'm going to just introduce myself and what I'm going to do here with this, my objectives, and then I'll turn off the camera so we can see the presentation in a wider screen format. I expect not to take longer than 20 minutes. And obviously in this time, my intention isn't to talk about macro level numbers about how much the developed countries are contributing per year, or promising, or not delivering, or delivering. I think that's not the relevance of the presentation I want to do today. Rather, I really want to provide some specific insights, some experience in working with adaptation finance, which hopefully will be useful. I won't go into the specifics of the different funds because there are many, but I will provide some links to where you can access this information on your own time. So this is really about providing very practical recommendations to make sure that your pursuit for finance for taking your projects forward is as useful as possible. I'm hoping everyone can hear me well. I'm looking at the chats on the bottom. So now I'm going to turn off the camera and maximize the presentation so you can hopefully see it better. Okay, so this is what I want to discuss today. First, just some comments on climate adaptation and resilience. It's the main point of our presentation. Provide an overview of the major funds and instruments for financing adaptation. And I'll look with a particular focus at the climate investment funds of the World Bank and its MDB partners, and in particular one fund, which is the pilot program on climate resilience, which I have been involved in personally as a consultant to the African Development Bank, but also touch on other sources of support for adaptation, bilateral sources, and also the important aspect of private sector finance. Then some notes to take into consideration, and finally some useful sources of information and follow-up where you can get more information about the different funds and sources of finance that are available. So the first slide is really just an overview. Mitigation is an interesting area. Mitigation can be projects of renewable energy, or it can be energy efficiency. It can also be addressing deforestation or land degradation. And it's a very important aspect of climate work, where we're trying to halt the advance of emissions of global emissions of greenhouse gases. The idea being that we can, through our efforts, we can block some of the rapid advancement of greenhouse gases with global warming potential in the atmosphere to prevent climate change. However, it's becoming clear that this is progressing anyway, in spite of our efforts, and what we really need to do is concentrate on adaptation. Now, adaptation can be many things. It can be adapting agricultural practices, or look at living locations or living customs. It can be adaptation of infrastructure, for example, ports and airports. It can also be adapting in infrastructure regulation. For example, how near the coastal zone can tourist developments be located. Perhaps that has to be farther away from the coastal zone in order to attend to the risks presented from sea level rise. If we take a step back, then we're wanting also at a strategic level to enhance resilience. Now, what does this mean? It requires planning and thinking that we need to build our capacity to respond to shocks, respond to floods, respond to droughts. We need to build our resilience. And if we take a step back from that, we first need to understand what are the risks that we face. So we need to do climate risk assessment, and also integrating these risks into our development strategies and policies. So there are different steps to do. Some of them are very practical and based on infrastructure or projects. Others are more policy-based and strategy-based and require a lot of research. All of these are important, and a lot of these funds will target different aspects of this scale. That's an important thing to bear in mind. There are specific funds which are concretely for mitigation or adaptation or for building resilience, and a lot of different projects also for assessing climate risks. So let's bear in mind the difference between these two. Of course, there are also instruments which generally can tap into or can help mobilize all of these. And so here's a little tip or suggestion. If we look at, there's a lot of finance available for mitigation projects, to put a solar power plant or a wind generating station. That's clear. Let's have a look at a typical adaptation project, which might be to develop wells in the countryside for providing, and pumps, for providing irrigation to smallholder farmers. This is clearly an adaptation project. However, if the pumps are solar power based, for example, with photovoltaics, then it's still an adaptation project, but it's also a mitigation project. So projects can be adaptation and mitigation. And in doing so, you may actually open up your window of opportunities to financing. So that's just a tip. Looking at the next slide, some general comments. First of all, there's not a one-stop shop. There are many different sources of financial support to adaptation. They work for different sets of countries. Some of them are only available for least developed countries. Others target industrializing economies or developing economies. Some of them are for specific beneficiaries, for example, just to national institutions, NGOs. Some of them are specifically for companies. Some of them target a group and actually favor partnerships between the private sector and NGOs, for instance. So it's important to take these into consideration. And also, as I was talking about, some funds and sources of finance can be for different activities, whether they're capacity building or for a startup or seed finance to get a project going. They can be for example, monitoring and evaluation activities. So before starting out, it's very important that you're clear about what it is that you're trying to finance. What is your sector, your country, and find out which applies to you. Not all of them will be, and the more you can closely define what are the specific objectives of your adaptation activity or project, the more successful you'll be and the more efficient you'll be with time. This is a slide. Maybe many of you won't be able to see the fine details, but that's okay. My point with this slide is to demonstrate that there's many different sources of funds and financial instruments to support climate adaptation. What we have along the top row are contributing countries. This is not a full list, of course. It mentioned Australia and Canada, the EU, France, Germany, Japan, Norway, UK, and US, and their respective bilateral institutions. It's not a full list. For example, Spain has a very important development cooperation program at the national level, but also its autonomous regions, many of them have each also their own development support program. So there's many different sources of bilateral support. Not all of them will be supporting climate change. That has to be studied. Then there's also the multilateral institutions, whether they are associated with the UNFCCC institutions, for example, the Global Environmental Facility or the Adaptation Fund, or entirely different or separate financial mechanisms, which don't have to do, they are not linked with the UNFCCC, but of course they contribute to the overall objectives. And here we can be talking about organizations, for example, UNDP, that might have specific programs, or we're talking also about the Millennium Development Banks, such as, for Africa, the African Development Bank. Many different organizations, many different funds, and these have to be looked at. This particular slide is pulled from a website, and I provide this link further on, a website called climatefundupdate.org. All the links are provided. I find this very, very useful because it provides a brief description on all these funds, access to the sites, it tells you how much finance is there, and it's really an interesting resource to bear in mind, and I recommend it as a good information source. I want to then look at one particular area of funds, which is a very important one. It's the climate investment funds, which are run by the World Bank and the partner Millennium Development Banks. And there's different funds, specifically with specific funds within the climate investment funds. There's a clean technology fund, a forest investment program. There is a different one for scaling up renewable energy, but specifically the one that I'm going to focus on now as an example of a fund to support adaptation and resilience is called the PPCR, or the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience. It's a fund that covers several different countries in terms of its implementation. It's a large fund with 1.3 billion US dollars of finance behind it. It supports various different countries throughout Africa, South America, Caribbean, and the Pacific. And the reason I'm focusing on this one is because I also work directly with this fund as a consultant to the African Development Bank. The objectives are generally to support pilot projects to integrate climate risk and resilience, and also, very important, and I think I've got a pointer, here we go. It does something very important, which is to initiate transformational change. This is very important. It's supposed to be a catalyst. In Africa, presently, it is active in Mozambique, Niger, and Zambia. However, decisions could be taken in future that would expand it to other climate investment fund countries. So in Africa, this includes Burkina Faso, DR Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Mali, Morocco, Nigeria, South Africa, and Tanzania. So it could open up to many different different countries. Mostly, it is a public sector fund. It supports public programs which are aligned with the NAPA, the National Adaptation Program of Action, but also a more recent and important document in each country, which is called the Strategic Program for Climate Resilience, SPCR. So this means that this funding line attends to strategic orientations for building resilience in each country. Mostly, it's, as I'm saying, a public sector fund. However, and attending to the fact that we now know that most people checking in are from the private sector, these are just some slides. You can see them later. These are the examples of projects in the case of Zambia that have been supported by the MDB partners, in this case the IFC, the African Development Bank, and the World Bank, just to let you know the kinds of public sector projects that are supported by PPCR. However, there's also financing opportunities for the private sector within PPCR. And this comes in recognition that the private sector also has a very important role in supporting adaptation and resilience activities. Although the private sector often is unaware that they have this role or how to get support for taking these forward. So the PPCR has a private sector facility with concessional loans. These aren't grants, these are loans, but under very preferential rates. Therefore, larger projects. They're not for small and medium enterprises because they're handled through Millennium Development Banks, which are larger institutions who are customarily used to working with public sector institutions. So it's available for larger enterprise, although in future there could be solutions where this kind of funding goes through local banks, and so it becomes available for small and medium enterprise to support projects, whether they are projects in the agriculture sector, whether they support, for example, the development of wells, whether they support building technologies that take into consideration energy efficiency, harboring from the sun's rays, whatever it may be. In this next slide, I've put this down because it's a very interesting indication of the kind of criteria that funds may look for, in this case with the private sector set aside for PPCR. First of all, it's very important that any candidature has to be aligned strategically, in this case with the SPCR. Whatever the case may be, if you're doing a climate adaptation application, finance application, then you need to know what are the criteria, and very important, what are the strategic orientations for a particular country or a particular region. It's very important to make that case. Next, you have to show the level of innovation. What kind of innovation does this project provide? Is it in the business model? Are there different kinds of instruments or structure for handling the finance which is more inclusive? Does it bring in gender considerations? What is the level of innovation? Very important as well is readiness. Are we dealing with a concept which is for investigating more as a research project? Is it a demonstration project? This may not be applicable for many funds because they may want a project which is already ready for action, which is quick to implement. So you have to take into consideration the timeline. Of course, level of benefits to vulnerable groups is an important consideration as well. And finally, very important as well, is something that we look for when we're assessing private sector projects under PPCR, which is how sustainable is the project? Does it depend eternally on financing, or is there thought being given to making sure that in future, when it's up and going, there are ways to finance it by itself so that it is sustainable over time. I'll leave this for another time. These are just some of the examples of private sector projects which were financed under PPCR from previous rounds. Other sources of support include bilateral institutions. This could be fast start commitments under the UNFCCC, but also decentralized cooperation programs. Sometimes, for example, in the cases of Sweden and Netherlands, they are handled directly by the embassies of each country. And there's also centralized support programs. One example is the International Climate Fund of the UK. It's centrally organized and has a specific program which is available for different countries. Find out in your own country which are the embassies or which are the development agencies, bilateral development agencies, which are attentive to climate and where you can investigate what the opportunities are for adaptation. For the private sector, there are some local banks and specialized credit agencies that might be attentive to this. Perhaps they also have funding from, and that's the next point, sub-regional, regional, or multilateral development banks. If the projects are large enough, then there are facilities directly to these multilateral development banks. And one example is the PPCR through the African Development Bank, which has had a yearly call. Also, of course, there's the usual financing that a private sector might attend to, equity partners, venture capital sources. But, and here I bring the next slide over, bear in mind that acquiring finance is complex. Institutional finance is very complex. We have to understand who to contact, what are the eligibility criteria, when there are commitments to finance. One thing is the commitment. The other thing is when that finance actually becomes available to implement the project. That's not necessarily easy. In order to set up a candidature like this, it requires quite a bit of technical capacity. The applications must be very well written. The project concept notes must really make a strong case because these are competitive. The budgeting and the financial planning is crucial and has to be very, very well demonstrated. So this is very, very important, and sometimes this capacity is lacking, whether it's with public institutions or private companies. Sometimes this is lacking, and it needs to be reinforced so that the applications are strong. Just a note to the moderator, to Rocio, I'm wrapping up. I know my time is coming close, and these are points in conclusion already. So, process, budgeting, monitoring and reporting frameworks, these are all very important elements of any candidature, whether it's institutional or private sector finance. You need to have capacity to write this up properly. Organizations which have this internally, excellent. If not, do seek training for that capacity or seek the technical assistance. This may be from specialized NGOs working in the country. There are sometimes specialized consultancies or associations which can help provide this, this resource. Okay? Otherwise, consider establishing a partnership and making an application between, if you are an NGO or if you're a government agency, linking up with a private sector consultant or a specialized NGO that has this capacity. Establish a partnership. I'm going to jump to the next slide to give an example of something that is happening now. This is a real opportunity. With the African Development Bank, it's called the Africa Climate Change Fund. And specifically, it provides financial support up to $250,000 for climate finance readiness activities. So this is a fund that's available to support acquiring the capacity to actually propose good projects to climate adaptation finance. So it's very relevant to what we're talking about now. Okay, the deadline is 8th of August. I provide the link below. Do check it out. If you're interested in applying for climate finance to an adaptation project, consider this as a way of preparing for that application. While we do that, I'm also at the end of the presentation going to show another source of very, very interesting information. This is on a website which is run by the World Bank and the UNDP. Sorry, there's a different one. I'll put the links on here, and it provides other training facilities that specifically build capacity to preparing climate adaptation finance proposals. Here we go. This is almost my last slide, just with some links. You don't have to worry about this now. This is going to be provided to you, and you can find out the links from this. Very interesting, both from the African Development Bank. Something I strongly recommend with the African Development Bank, I have here climate finance newsletters. Get on those newsletters. You find out all sorts of information about real opportunities as they happen. What are the new funding lines? When are the deadlines? What are the links to more information? Very, very important. So you can find that link, you can register on that mailing list. The climate funds updates I've told you about, very, very good. Who's financing? What are the different funds available? Excellent. Climate investment funds tell you about specifically the CIF funds, and you can find out information about PPCR, which projects have run in the past, what are we looking for in future calls. But there are other opportunities, and I'm going to post one right now that you can look for afterwards. This is the one that is done by the World Bank and UNDP. It's an excellent source of information about, can you see it? There we go. Climate finance options. You have, on this page, you can choose whether it's adaptation, capacity building, mitigation projects, whatever it is in whatever country, and find out what is applicable. So it's a good first step to identifying what may be applicable to you, your institution, and your objectives. Well, I think that's my time for just now. I know we have good time to have discussion and to answer other questions. I hope this has been useful, and so I'm going to now pass back to Rocio.
Sergio, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I think that it has been very useful to know where it's possible to look for some funds, but also some of the issues that probably several of the participants need to consider when applying for funds in terms of climate change. So we have enough time to have questions on the chat. So while you warm up with your questions, I would say, well, there are several participants that were included after we started. One of the first issues to mention is that we were indicated that actually for the survey we missed out East Africa. Sorry about that. But well, we have seen on the chat that there are several participants from East Africa. So thank you for joining us. We mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that the presentations will be available from the website of African Climate. So we will not be sending them separately. And also the webinar, the recording will be also available from a link from our website, from the African Climate Change Project. So please check the website next week to find the presentations and also the recording of the webinar. So Sergio, while we receive some of the questions from the participants, I would like to ask you just if you have been working with the African Development Bank, so maybe you can just tell us a little bit of one of the latest projects that you have been able to work with, and what has been your participation on that. So have you been advising or reviewing the project or advising on the financial aspects? Could you just tell us a little bit about that? Are you there?
Hello, I'm here now. And saying yes, I'd be glad to. My experience is, well, I'm coming from an environmental and climate change background, and so I've been working with the climate investment funds being handled by the African Development Bank. So we did a roadshow to inform private sector, but also all the other stakeholders, specifically in Niger, in Zambia, and Mozambique. So I ran some seminars in Lusaka, and Maputo, and Niamey, informing about the PPCR, and also meeting with the private sector to try to understand what are their needs, what are they looking for, what kind of projects they have, and how we might be useful in supporting them. Then, getting this information, I could say, well, this is an interesting project from a technical standpoint. It seems to be very, very good and would lead to some good results in terms of adaptation or building resilience. However, I am then confronted with colleagues who are more from the finance section. And African Development Bank is a bank. And they have to look at the financing and the economics of the project and see whether they stand up. And it's a very, very interesting process of going back and forth and seeing which projects are actually financially sound. Okay, where does the income come from? Will the projects be sustainable into the future? Are the let's say, the expectations reasonable about whether the selling of an agricultural product or the participation of smallholder farmers in buying up a particular technology, are those expectations real in the business plan? These are all very important elements to consider. And so this has been a very good, interesting opportunity of learning for me. And that's what I'm trying to do, is share that experience from somebody who's starting off, whether you're working with an NGO or working with a small and medium company, to bear in mind the kinds of questions, the kinds of criteria that will be considered in doing up a climate finance project.
Okay, thank you very much, Sergio. So we already have several questions from the participants. So I would like to start with one from James Mitchell. So on what sort of financing mechanisms do you think exist that could help fund the creation of a portfolio of commercial-scale solar PV systems in Kenya?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So it's a
Yes.
question on the chat from James Mitchell. So it is on financing mechanisms for the creation of a portfolio of commercial-scale solar PV systems, particularly in Kenya.
Quick answer to that, because I understand this is more of a mitigation side project and not so much an adaptation project. But there are several different funding sources, whether you can use carbon instruments like the CDM or voluntary carbon markets to support this. There are sources of EU funding which come along every 2 or 3 years which can support this. And it also might be just a very good private sector project, almost requiring no funding as well, just a business project. There's different sources of funding for a project like this. This is a standard business project to set up PV. I would also suggest you look at different funds within the African Development Bank. AFDB has specific financing for projects like that. There's a sustainable energy fund. There are scaling up renewable energy funds. So you have to look at, I would suggest look at climate finance with AFDB and take it from there. Also, this link that I provided in the chat here also has a section on mitigation. So you can go there and specify the technology, specify the country, and see what comes up.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from John Jebua, which is also on mitigation. So I think that what you have answered now, it applies also to mitigation on renewable energy and energy efficiency. So I will move to another question that is more related to adaptation. So there is one from Mary Scholes, and she wants to know if you could comment on what funders mean by showing in the proposal how the project will become more sustainable and in what time frame.
Yes, that's an excellent question. I'm going to, can you still see the my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so I've put back to this criteria. What we look for in sustainability, this isn't about butterflies and grass. What we mean by this is, will the project be sustainable economically, for example, or as a model, a business model, or an activity model? Can it be sustained over time without always requiring external funding? Okay, so for example, this is a relevant question because one of the times when we're setting up a project, we need help to address the immediate need for finance, to set things up, set up the structures, buy equipment, acquire human resources, procure the appropriate human resources. We need that from the onset. And then we need to start to demonstrate the use of our product or our service or our activity until we have enough support from different places. Whether that means we find other sources of institutional funding, whether that means we are selling a product which then has buyers. That initial period needs to be supported. However, what we mean by sustainability is, does this activity, does this project, or even if it's a business project, does that business project stand to be autonomous, stand to make money, and be able to pay back debts over time? Yes? After how much time? So we have to know that, we have to be able to model that after, for example, 2 years, the project will be deriving revenue or generating other income flows or having other sources of institutional finance that will make the project go on into the future. I think this is because in the past, a lot of institutional finance was going to projects which had a lifespan of, for example, 2 or 3 years. You do a project, you set it up, invest a lot of institutional finance, and once the project is no longer financed, it ends. all the capacity that was built, all the equipment, all the activity suddenly stops without any continuation. Well, that's just not efficient as in any circumstance, and certainly it makes no sense as a private sector job, as a private sector business idea. You really have to set up for the long term. And so that's what we mean by sustainability of intended results. Does the project consider a long-term goal, and is it set up to look for ways of sustaining it into the future?
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Okay, well, thank you very much for that answer. I think it's clearer now. And also we have another question. Let me go back, and it is from Shabani Belashev. And he says that they have a private company, Shatexa, in Tunisia, and they have two technologies related to climate change, and they want to know how to use available funds. That they says they can conceive a project based on the two technologies, buried diffuser and draining floater. And the two technologies were awarded by UNESCO, World Bank,
so
Foreign Affairs.
Not knowing what the technologies are, just from this short description, I don't know. But we have to, as I say, we have to understand whether this is principally a mitigation project, or if it can be attributed to or categorized as an adaptation or resilience project, and take it from there. There are many different sources of finance, as I've mentioned. And my recommendation in a first instance would be to look at the two websites that I provided, one in the presentation and this other one that I've provided in the link below as a first step. Of course, you have my email in the presentation. You can contact me anyway, and if I can be of help in pointing in the right direction, I will.
Okay, thank you. So the question from Caterina Brandoni, I think it's also related to that. So it would be the same thing. Yeah, if it was mentioned before that some research projects can be on adaptation and mitigation, and that probably this will increase your possibilities of finding funds for that. We have another question from Aitlaja, sorry about pronunciation, and I think this is quite interesting. How to improve the access to this information for a wider range of stakeholders?
I think that's a very important question, which has in some ways been addressed by these multilateral organizations who try to provide, for example, some sort of a portal to bring as much information as possible. Of course, this requires some knowledge already to get here, and it requires having a good internet capacity, and it requires some capacities. Mind you, in order to do a proper funding application for climate finance, there has to be a level of sophistication. There has to be the capacity to access information, the capacity to process and understand what the requirements are, the criteria, the deadlines, preparing a good proposal, as I was saying. So it requires all of this information. When I was in this roadshow, it's clear that there were some small companies and small associations who had excellent ideas on projects that would really make tangible effects on the ground with smallholder farmers. They were good ideas. However, their particular association was did not have very qualified human resources. They did not have technologies to access the internet. They seemed to be very far away, a huge gap from where they were and the good that they could do from access to this kind of finance. And that is where intermediary organizations really have a role. Whether they are business associations, sometimes NGOs who are specialized in doing this. There could be the support of, for example, one NGO that I witnessed or discussed with was a Dutch technical cooperation NGO called SNV. They're doing very interesting projects in Zambia and also Niger. And they were supporting this professionalization, let's say, of small private farmers in accessing this kind of support. This is very, very important. So that might be a way to do it. If you're needing this, find the partnership. Find who has the technical capacity to be able to help in accessing these funds, because it's difficult to do it on your own if you don't already have that capacity.
Okay. So I think that's quite interesting. I think there have been other questions related. Okay. So I think that's quite interesting. I think there have been other questions related to capacity building a little bit further down. Maybe one question on the which type of products make sense to private investors?
That's a very good question, and in some surveys taken, largely the private sector does not find that it has a role to play in this. Of course, when we think of adaptation, we consider large infrastructure developments, for example, to adapt a port infrastructure to increasing the landings so that they take into consideration storms, they take into consideration increasing sea level, etc. These aren't usually private sector investments. However, having said that, it's important to note that there are many very interesting projects which are private sector projects that make a direct contribution to resilience. As an example, in some countries, and I'm wondering if I have a slide specifically on that. Let me check something here. Yes, the very last slide of my presentation, which you see here, is a full listing by the UNFCCC on private sector projects recognized as benefiting climate adaptation. You have a full list of the projects with the respective project concept notes, which describe the projects, its objectives, and general finance information, and also the different partners. And you see a wide range of projects which make sense. It could be technology, communications technology. For instance, a telecoms company which provides weather information, advanced weather information to farmers on mobile phones, so that they are able to prepare adequately for an incoming storm or for very windy situations. That's one example. They could be agricultural projects which include the production of whatever. It could be the production of food staples. It could be the production of whether it's fish or food commodities or energy crops, which attend to specific needs of local people and use some sort of innovation that allows them to be more climate resilient. If, for instance, a private company wants to provide sustainable, renewable energy source to substitute for the felling of trees to produce charcoal, whether it is using the husks of some agricultural product into small briquettes, whether it is to set up a sustainable forest to produce firewood or charcoal, which avoids the felling of other useful trees, that can be an interesting climate resilience project. There may be very many different aspects to this. Also, one of the examples I provided, which is the establishment of a partnership that will provide wells to farmers and set up the technology that perhaps uses, instead of using the regular pumps using fossil fuels, they use PV pumps, photovoltaic pumps. This is very interesting. It's a climate resilience project, but there is a business rationale. There's a business model. There's a benefactor who is a small farmer who will be able to produce more. He will pay for this equipment, maybe requiring finance from a local bank. And there has to be the technology to provide this, and there has to be technical capacity to know how to dimension it. There's a role here for private sector. So it's not something that's far out. The private sector does really have a role and possibilities and access to finance for this. So I would wholly encourage you to look at this website provided by the UNFCCC. It's inspiring.
Okay. There have been other comments on the chat from one of our experts. Okay, good. There have been other comments on the chat from even one of our ex-colleagues from the project. I would just like to move to last two questions. So one of them is on how do you think that African countries are actually responding to the capacity building for this type of climate change action?
There are clearly good examples of activities and projects which develop capacity and install the capacity in that country, whether it's an information resource center, whether it's informing people who then go on to build capacity of professional peers and stakeholders. And these are good examples. I have also, unfortunately, witnessed some bad examples where individuals receive a lot of training but then are swept up by other organizations or private sector companies without having left that capacity or the means to share that capacity with other stakeholders in the country or the region. So the capacity stays with the individual, and there are many cases of this, and it's a shortfall. It's a lack, or let's say it could be much improved by ensuring that whatever project happens, whatever capacity building, training, information center has, and now I'm going to use a term that was used before, and we even had a question on it, an element of sustainability and demonstration that that capacity will be rolled out, that capacity will have a means of being shared with others. Then it becomes useful.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Well, one of the last questions, or actually the last question, is on the... Okay, thank you very much, Sergio. Well, one of the last questions, so actually the last question, it's on the... You have mentioned it several times, so maybe just reminding on at least one of the links that you provided on financing for NGO and private sector partnerships.
Different funds available to NGOs. I'm imagining we're talking about national NGOs, usually small organizations, which are on the ground and many times really have the capacity to reach out to the actual projects. These are very important, and often they have very good capacities. People who have, who are very professional, sometimes very, very well trained. So what are the different means? I would suggest having a look at seeing which embassies and bilateral programs might be operating in the particular country in which you're located, because there might be support. I would also encourage you to keep in tune with mailing lists and newsletters such as the one from African Development Bank to find out, and also the European Commission, to find out when funding lines become available. These are usually every once in a while. There was a funding line, I believe it's now taken a different form, called the Energy Facility of the European Commission. The Energy Facility was open every 2 years, I believe, with finance which went up to 75% of sustainable energy projects. And it required partnerships, and that's a very interesting thing. So that means a partner from a beneficiary country, which could be any country in the region of Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific, and it usually required also a partner, which usually was a consultancy in Europe. And this was a very interesting facility that provided very, very pragmatic results. It's an interesting source of information and an interesting source of finance. Usually, I would say the large Millennium Development Banks, like the African Development Banks, they're not set up to provide finance for NGOs. They're working more with public authorities and the larger private sector. But these are some of the sources I would suggest to look for. And obviously these websites that I've provided have a lot of that information, and you can look there for financing opportunities as is specific to your particular activity in your particular country.
Okay. Sergio, again, thank you very much for joining us, for giving us this excellent webinar. We also want to thank you. Okay. Sergio, again, thank you very much for joining us, for giving us this excellent webinar. We also want to thank you, all the participants of the webinar. We would like also to invite you to review our African Climate Portal, where we also have the financial section, and we have also the news section, several links as well. So you can also look at some of the upcoming events related also to financing, to other links of projects opened or calls opened in terms of financing grants, financing funds for climate change, both adaptation and mitigation projects. So with this, we just want to remind you that you will receive an email with the links to both the webinar and the slides, the PowerPoint presentations. And with this, we would like to thank again everybody.
Goodbye. Very good to participate in this, and very good to see so much action going on in the chat section. It means it's dynamic, so it's good to do this webinar with this group, and I thank you very much, the organizing organization, for doing such an excellent job also with the technology.